along to do more of CSS. And I'm going to be typing now. So we're following the same materials that are listed on the web page. It's still within the CSS part, and I'm now at the CSS box model, which requires me to open this CSS box 2.1. I'm going to increase a little bit the font sizes. Okay, so let me remind you what we're looking at here. This is a browser window, it's Chrome. At the top, it's actually the window, the way it's going to show. At the bottom, I open the inspector, which you can open by right-clicking on any element on the page and say inspect element. This is going to open the inspector, and it's going to position the inspector exactly on the element on which you right-click. In this case, it was an inner div. So let me explain first what's in this new document, because this is a new HTML that we haven't seen before. It's a very simple HTML that contains one div of class outer. This is the outer div. And notice as I mouse over the div in the debugger, the upper window highlights the div that I'm actually pointing to. So also in the debugger, we can see that the div contains some text and then contains a nested div with class inner, and notice the highlighted div on the page, and then it contains some more text after the div. So the first observation that I want to make, div by default in a browser, it's what's called a block element. A block element means that it's rendered always starting on a new line. So even though this div essentially the HTML, you can imagine being all one line. Text before div element, then a div element, and then the text after the div element, which is the text. Okay? But notice that the moment the browser encountered the nested div, it started a new line and positioned the nested div, on a new line, and then the text afterwards. So as long as you write text, it all goes in line, and line breaks when it gets to the end of the page. But if they are nested block elements, they all get rendered on their own new lines. If you want to achieve something similar, like have a nested element that's inline, then there are several ways of doing it. One is called span. So you replace this div with span. Span is another HTML element that's rendered inline. And that's how you would put an image, for example, in line with your text. Okay, so that's first observation. So next, I'm gonna set some styles for these div elements. First, I'm gonna set some background. For the outer one, we're gonna make it green, I think. Background color green. Notice how very conveniently this style editor that I'm doing here does completion for you. So I always experiment with my style in this inspector, and then I copy these definitions into the actual HTML or style files, because it's a lot easier. So notice the selector, what we discussed before. This applies to anything of class outer, in particular to this div that has class outer. And if I had multiple divs like that, all would become green. Then I'm clicking on the inner div here, and I'm clicking this plus to add a new style element. And the inspector conveniently preset my selector to inner. But I could edit it. I could go and say, I want something more specific. I want the div that's inner. Make sure I don't apply it too broadly. And I'm making this also background color yellow. And by the way, very conveniently here, when you set colors, you can click on this color button, and now you have a lot more control over the color that you want. And you can set your color with this color editor. And notice that at the bottom, you get this hexadecimal number. This is another way in which you can write colors in CSS. So if I now close this window, go back here, notice that I got the color that I chose, and I got this particular name for the color. It's a numeric name. So this is how I choose colors. Okay, so the main goal of this section of the lecture is to talk about sizing of these divs, because when you're creating your pages, you want to have different elements being different positions and of different sizes. First, we're going to look at sizing, and then next we're going to look at positioning. Okay? For sizing, by default, what you can see is that the browser will make all divs as wide as the page. If you don't say anything, it gets to be as wide as the page. And you can see that if you set the background color. The background color extends all the way to the right. Furthermore, the divs by default get vertical size gets as big as it needs to fit the contents inside. So if I add more text in this inner inside div element, it's gonna increase in height. If I add nested divs within the inner div, they're further going to be increasing the size. So let's play now a little bit with what you can do with these divs. All of the block elements in CSS and HTML are rendered using what's called the box model. Box model refers to the dimensions and the different elements that can go around the element. By default, you get pretty much an empty box model, meaning you have just the content. No borders, no margins, no nothing. So I'm going to show now how you start adding some of these elements. So I'm clicking on this inner div, and I'm editing its style. And as I said, there are literally tens, if not hundreds, of attributes that you can set for style. So we're going to play with a few more. First, we're going to add a border to the inner div. So border. And notice here in the completion window, the browser, there's many ways to control the border. But one of them that I use often is just the border element. And for the border, you need to specify 3 values. First is the width of the border. We're going to make it fairly robust so that we can see it, 10 pixels. Space, then the type of the border. The common one is solid. Okay, and you already start seeing the border appearing there. It's this black thing. It's 10 pixels wide, and it goes all over the content. Okay, and then optionally, space and the color. And I'm going to make this blue. Okay, I don't know if this is good for early morning, but there it is. Okay, so the moment you add the border, notice how the outer dimension of the box, stays fixed at the width of the page, and essentially the inner content of the box gets squeezed to accommodate the border. Sometimes you want fancier borders, and you can change the border. Of course, you can change the width, the type, and the color, as I've shown here. But you can also control independently all the 4 borders. So, in addition to that general border declaration, I'm going to add a specific declaration for the top border. This means that the top border will take this more specific declaration. The other borders are going to be inheriting the generic declaration. So here we're going to make this somewhat thinner, 5 pixels at the top. Okay, so what happened now? I just typed 5 pixels, and what it looks like the upper border has actually disappeared. So that's because we haven't specified the type of the border. And by default, the border doesn't show. This is actually confusing. Let's make it dashed instead of solid, and let's make it something more lively, yellow. Okay. And sometimes what I do when I want to really control things carefully, I magnify the browser window, And this allows you to see if everything is lined up exactly as you want if you're very picky. So I'm going to decrease it in size now so that we can see everything. And notice how it tries to be smart there at the transition of the borders, to transition from a 10 pixel to a, whatever this was, a 3 pixel border, and different color. Okay, so that's it with the borders. Next we're going to add padding. Padding is, let me show you, padding. And we're going to specify 20 pixels padding. Padding is the name for the space that gets added inside the border around the content. So notice how the border stayed the dimensions that we had before, but now we added all of this space here, above, to the left, to the bottom, and to the right, although we can't see it. So this makes sure that your borders are not touching the content. You want to leave some space between the inner content and the actual border. So you control that with padding. And then there's another space that you can add outside the border, and that's called margin. Margin, and we'll make this even bigger, 30 pixels. Maybe it's a little bit too big. Okay, so this shows all of the elements of the box model of the sizing. So you have the content, then it's surrounded by padding, surrounded by border, surrounded by margin, and then the box ends here. Notice that the margin technically belongs to your parent. It gets the background color of your parent. Okay, so the background only applies to the content and the padding. Then the border has its own color. And the margin, you specify the space where the color comes from the pad. Furthermore, furthermore, you can control margins independently, the 4 margins, like the borders. You can control the paddings independently, the 4 paddings. And so this, you can start to see why we have so many different attributes that we can control in CSS. Okay. One more thing I want to show you. What if we start to specify sizes? I'm going to specify now the width of the box. So this inner div, I didn't specify a width, so by default it gets width 100%. It essentially stretches all the way to expand it to the window. But if you set the width to 400 pixels, this is what you get. Okay? So now you can control the width, and you can control it as a percentage of the page or in precise pixels like this. Furthermore, something that I find quite useful, in the inspector, instead of trying, sometimes when you want to get things just right, you have to try different dimensions. You can do that by clicking any of these numbers, like the 20 pixels, and using the up arrow and down arrow. So if I use the up arrow, it increases by 1. And this way you can fine-tune it to get things exactly as you want. So back to 20 pixels. The other thing I wanted to show you is as you move the mouse over this the inspector window, the browser will highlight in the main window the actual element you're pointing to, and will also give you the dimensions. So this is actually very convenient. Well, what happened here? You probably can't see from the room, but the browser says that this inner div has width of 460 pixels and has height of 73.33 pixels. Well, but didn't we say that it should have a width of 400 pixels? Okay, so what has happened? Actually, can you tell why, even though we said, I'm going to zoom here a little bit. Even though we set the width of 400 pixels, the actual width is 460. The actual width shown by the browser. It includes the margins, okay? Because the margins are 30 each side, left and right, so that's 460. And you can actually see that if you scroll here in the style window, you scroll further down, it shows you the box model for the particular div that's selected. And it shows that the inner content is 400 width by this height. It shows you the padding, and in fact, if you move the mouse, it highlights the padding on the screen. It shows the border, and it shows the margin. That's 30. Okay? So, yes?
The 460 actually doesn't include the margin. It's actually the border and padding.
Yes, you're correct. It's the border and padding, not the margin. Other questions or observations or corrections? Okay, so you should expect to have to tinker quite a bit with the inspector to get things right. And but I wanted you to understand what's possible and where to go to look for help. Imagine trying to get this right before we had the inspectors. It was quite painful. Okay, so let's now move on to we know how to size things. How do we place them where we want on the page? And for this, I'm going to open another HTML. It's called CSS position 31-31, if I'm correct. I'm not correct. Okay, so this is another div we'll be playing with. Let's first see what's there, and then let's play with it. So this HTML, let's scroll this up, contains one container div, and notice that this is the entire thing that's highlighted. And notice also that the style, I defined the style for this container to have a border of 1 pixel. This accounts for this black border. I wanted the border because I want to see, as we're playing with the positioning of the 3 boxes, which I'm going to increase in size just now so you can see better. Okay, this will tell us the parent div how big it is. And inside, if I expand here the container, I see that I have a sequence of 3 divs. One with text box 1, box 2, and box 3. These divs have classes. They all have the class inner. And then I also have class inner 1, inner 2, inner 3 for when I need to carefully control only one of them. If I want to control something about all 3 inner divs, I use the class inner. If I want something only about the middle one, I use inner 2. Okay, so as I said before, if you have a sequence of divs, the browser will put each one on a new line. That explains why box 1, box 2, and box 3 are on top of each other. And then the parent container gets to be the size that accommodates all of its children. Box 1, box 2, box 3. All of these boxes are dimensioned explicitly through styles, as we see here for, this is a box 1. I'm using div.inner1 to refer to box 1. And I gave them different colors so that we can see what's happening to them as we play with them. Okay, any questions? No questions. Okay, so let's start moving these along. I'm going to be playing with box 2. And I'm going to show you a different way to position it. The default positioning, a box starts on a new line, aligned on the left of its parent container, and expands as much as needed. But I can change the position to relative. Okay, and doing this by itself, it's not going to have any visual effect. Nothing has changed there. But this is just getting ready for me to specify some numeric position elements. With the relative position, what you can do is tell the browser, position the box first where you think it should be, and then move it from that position relative, a few pixels left, a few pixels down or up. And you do that by using the left. So I'm going to move it 50 pixels, actually it's moving it to the right. It's moving so essentially it's setting the left edge at 50 pixels relative to its original position. Okay, so it's important to realize, okay, and let me do the top as well. Top, I'll do 20 pixels. So what I've done here, I positioned the left of the box 50 pixels away from its default position, and I positioned the top 20 pixels away from its default position. But what is very important to realize is that with position relative, everything else stays the same. Just notice the space in there. So the positioning of all of the neighboring elements happens before this box is moved. That's sometimes and you use this a lot actually to just nudge things a little bit further to the left, right, without affecting the neighbors. Okay, so that's one way of positioning, position relative. And again, very handy here, this up-down arrow on numeric values to kind of nudge things. Like if you want to align it to match exactly the edge of that position, then you go there, you zoom it to make sure you get the, you get the pixels right. Okay. Let me change it back to 50 as it was and decrease this a little bit. Okay. So now I'm going to show you another position that's actually very powerful, but it has effects on the rest of the page. I'm going to change position relative to position absolute. Okay. So what happened?
The black border shrank and it doesn't include 2 anymore.
Right. So the container, the parent div, shrank in height, and there's no the space that was reserved for box 2 is gone. Okay. So with position absolute, the browser first takes these divs out of the layout and lays everything else out, and then brings and positions these perhaps on top of the existing elements. Okay. So with position absolute, you control the positioning, but the box is taken out of the parent. And if I were to change position absolute to box 1, 2, and 3, the container would get to be 0 height. Would shrink because there's nothing else that it needs to accommodate. Okay? And with position absolute, this is how you can get to lay out divs that are apparently outside of the parent. Otherwise, with position relative, you can actually. I take that back. That's not true. You can lay out even with relative. You can push a div outside of its parent div with relative. But the other thing that happened is now it's not clear what these 50 and 20 offsets mean. It's with respect to what? So it says left 50. Let's put it left 0 to see what it is aligned to. So this shows us, so notice that box 2 now is positioned, it's aligned with respect to the browser window. Actually, you will see it's with respect to the body. What happens is, and this is something that's easy to miss, and you may spend a lot of time debugging, why is it positioning where I want? Position absolute measures offsets with respect to the nearest parent that has a position relative or absolute. Because none of the parents we have specified the position for, it really is with respect to the body. So to fix that, I'm going now to the container div and changing its position to relative. Okay, you will see this sometimes. Position relative without a left, without a top. So without offsets. So this really means move it relative, but don't move it at all. It's a way of simply marking this parent as a parent that has positioning such that its children can be positioned with respect to it. Okay, so you have to sometimes do this on the parent of the div that you want to move along. So let's go back here and put this 50 back in. So now it's 50 offset left from its from the container, which is really this this border, and it's 20 down from the container. So the space here at the top is 20. And by the way, you can set these offsets to negative as well, and then it would move in the other direction. Okay. Here's one thing that I mentioned last time, but it's really I can show it again here. I told you that these check marks here you can check or uncheck to temporarily turn off one of these declarations to see what effect it has. So this is the position relative for the container. So notice if I unclick it, box 2 becomes, so essentially it's as if you didn't have this. Now it's positioned with respect to the body. It's still 20 down from the beginning of the body, and it's 50 right from the left edge. And if you turn it on, it moves it on. Okay, so I actually use this a lot if I want to explore a page that somebody else wrote and say, how did they do this? And I go see a bunch of declarations. I start turning them on and off, and I see things moving, changing colors, and then I realize exactly which declaration, what it affects. Because you can turn it on and off and see immediately the difference. Okay, one more position I want to show you. But to demonstrate that, let me first increase the height of this blue box to 300, or maybe even 200. 200 is okay. Okay, so I did that essentially so that the container div doesn't really fit on the page. You notice you can scroll it up and down. This is all as expected. Is a question?
If we, on the parent container class, if we have it on position relative, but then we also shift it to the left, is it also going to shift the absolute positioning to the left as well, or does that ignore it?
Okay, this is where I take advantage of being live here. I don't have to know the answer to this question. I can just try it.
Okay.
Yeah, so everything gets shifted. Okay, so, and again, you can turn this off or on, and let's turn it off for now. So, as you might expect now, the page is longer, taller than the actual window, so you scroll it up and down. Sometimes, rarely, but sometimes you need to have some elements that stay on the view in a particular position no matter how you scroll. For example, a navigation bar, or let's say that box 2 is some important message that has to be there, even if I come. Let's shrink this a little bit. Why can't I shrink it? See, box 2 goes out of the window. I always want box 2 to be on the window, even if I'm down looking at the bottom of the page. There's another position that helps you there. It's called position fixed. Position fixed, it's like absolute in the sense that elements with position fixed are taken out of the flow when the parent is being laid out. And then they're being positioned back, except this time they're positioned with respect to the browser view, not to the body. The body may scroll up and down. The browser view. Okay? So, fixed. So this is a position fixed with respect to this view. The body itself is bigger, but the view is just this. So it's 20 down and 50 a little bit to the right. And notice that now, if I scroll, it stays there. Okay? So you have to be careful how you use this. Use it rarely and smartly. The other thing you have to worry sometimes is about backgrounds being, things that you scroll through the window being visible to the window. So you have to change backgrounds opacity to make sure it's one thing that you could do, I don't know if I remember, I think it's alpha or opacity, doesn't even know. There's opacity 30%. No. Opacity. Okay, so I made box 2 being somewhat transparent. This is half transparent. And notice how stuff is seen, you can see through it now. Okay, so again, there are lots and lots of these things that you can achieve lots of cool things. It's worth actually scanning the documentation to see what you can do. Any questions about positioning? Okay, positioning is what I find to be the hardest by far thing in CSS. And this is just the beginning of it. I'll show you one more trick with positioning, and then there are frameworks, there are libraries that help you position, and with all of those, sometimes you'll still scratch your head of why are things where they are when they should be in some different place. So the other thing I want to show you in terms of positioning is, so we'll use the same HTML, floating. Okay, so by default, boxes actually go down the page. What time did we start? 9?
1:20.
Okay. Yes. Sorry, it's the beginning of the semester. I still have to. So we'll do this quickly, and then I'll give you a break. Okay. So boxes normally get laid out one below the other, but you can change that by. So I'm gonna change the inner. I'm gonna change the inner selector, which really applies to all boxes, and I'm gonna make them float left. Okay. So when you float boxes, what happens is they suddenly don't get all laid out on new lines. Instead, if there's, so the first box is laid as usual, but when the second box is laid, if there's room in the parent container to the right, it's being laid out to the right of it, and then box 3 and so on. And if you get to the end of your parent container, then you start from the beginning. Floating, I want to show it to you because it achieves easily some. For example, you can easily achieve multiple columns with floating. And now if I shrink the actual window, suddenly it'll turn from 3 columns to 2 columns if you can't put all of the elements. Imagine that you want to show picture thumbnails, and you make them float, and they'll just fill up the one line, and then they'll start on the next line. If you shrink the window, then everything will kind of re-laid out. So let me show you what happens if you set now the container width. Let's make it 320 pixel. No, before I do this, there's something that happened to our container. Can you notice? The border, I have a nice border, is gone. It's all turned into one line. When you have floating elements, essentially they don't get taken into account when you compute the height of the parent. So essentially, because all of these are floats, it's a little bit as if they were absolute. They get taken out when the size of the parent is computed. So the parent ends up being size 0. And this is confusing. Now you can see it because it has a border. But if it didn't have a border, it would completely disappear. And you'd wonder, where is my container? So you go highlight with the mouse a container, and you see there, you can probably read that, it says the height is 1.3 pixels. And it's all coming from the border. So the way you fix that is through a very weird, unintuitive way. You say, oh, well, there are several ways of fixing it, and you can read on the web. But overflow auto on the parent of floating elements will, among other things, make sure that the parent gets to be big enough to encompass essentially the biggest of the boxes. Okay, so notice how we kind of fix now the height of the parent. So we'll keep that for now, and now we'll turn back on this width of 320 pixels. So notice how the parent got smaller. And I'm using that kind of a cool down arrow trick to decrease by 1 pixel. And I'm now, the container matches exactly the parents. And if it's 1 pixel too small, things get re-laid out. If I make it 190 pixels and I go down, okay, and you get the same effect if you actually shrink the window, if you're looking at it on a small device. This float has this nice property. And one thing that's worth to know with float is that you can float not just to the left, you can float to right. And then everything gets floated to the right. And again, if I increase the container like 220 pixels, so box 1 gets floated to the right, box 2 gets floated next. There's no room for box 3, so it starts on a new line. And then one more thing I wanted to show you. If, let's say that box 3, you want to stop floating, you say float none. Okay, if you say float none, box 3 is not floated anymore. So notice where it is put there. So 1 is floated to the right, 2 is floated to the right, box 3 is placed normally. It's actually below box 2 because it was declared later. If you want to make, there's one more thing that you do sometimes. On box 3, you say clear both, meaning don't position this to the left or right of floating elements. So essentially really start afresh. So box 1 and 2 are floated, box 3 starts a normal float. Okay? And the other, so that essentially concludes the positioning. Any questions? Yes.
So sometimes the browser has a bigger screen or like a bigger monitor, you know. So how do you make the width consistent? I guess. Are you supposed to use percentages instead of?
Well, it's a very hard question, and with many different answers depending what exactly you want to achieve. Sometimes I actually specify a minimum width. I say, I don't care if your screen is this much. I really am not ready to lay out my page on such a small screen. I'm going to say that it's going to be laid out on at least 800 pixels, and you're going to have to scroll left and right. That's one answer. Okay, you say min width 800 pixels. If it's bigger, nice things will happen, but it's not going to shrink smaller. Because this is the hardest thing for a graphic designer. How you have a very beautiful page with lots of stuff, how do you cram that in 200 pixels? You can't. Sometimes you use these floating elements, and then as long as the width is as big as the biggest one, they'll still show up. They'll show vertically. There's all sorts of answers. Other questions?
To make a page responsive, there is library.
Okay, to make a page responsive, I'm not going to show it here, but you have to actually do it in warm-up 1, and there's some hints for how you do it. Essentially, when you write style declarations, you can say these style declarations apply to screen widths of this, in this range. You write a separate set of style declarations for screen widths, bigger screen widths. So you can actually completely relay out the page just by changing CSS, by giving different sets of declarations that apply to different screen sizes. That's how you make it responsive. Or you use libraries. Okay? And there's one library that's really very useful for layout that I use. It's called Bootstrap. Maybe in a future version of this lecture, I'll introduce it in lecture. But for now, I just wanted to show you the basic CSS. Okay? Okay, so we're done with CSS. It's time for a break. And, in the break, what I like to do to wake people up, not that you would fall asleep in lecture, but so I have puzzles for you to think about. Some of these are actually used in interview puzzles by me and others. Others are just fun puzzles I found around. So you're free to think about them for the next 2 minutes.
I was wondering you guys like something about
Yes.
so that means you guys are in full-time teams.
Yes. But you will have a choice of saying, I want to be with this.
Oh, is that guaranteed or is that?
I cannot guarantee because if I guarantee too much, the problem is going to solve it.
Yeah.
Right? So, but I will try.
Okay.
I'll see if it works.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah. Literally number 2.
Okay, so did you get a chance to think about this? If it strikes your fancy? How is it possible to end up at the same starting point? Oh, you saw my hint from the next line, huh? Okay, let's see. You were the first one, the green shirt.
She's on some sort of sphere or something?
Yeah, I should have played some Earth.
Yeah.
And?
Well, like, if you're on a small enough sphere and you like, if the...
It's the Earth. It's the Earth.
So she's on Earth.
It's not smaller than 1 mile.
Okay.
But you're close, you're close. That's great, North Pole. So, if she's at the North Pole, you walk south, then whatever, east, and then north, you end up in the same place. And the next question, a hint for you would be that, you see a bear, and then what color of bear it is. Okay? But that's not the only answer.
It's on a moving surface.
Yeah, she's on Earth, moving surface. No, she's on Earth. Okay, I should clarify this. Okay, walks on Earth. And the Earth is not that small. Okay. Now you're seeing my other hint at the bottom. Okay, think about it. There's an infinite number of solutions. Not just the North Pole. And actually, for the other solutions, she's not going to see a bear. Let's switch back to CSS, HTML. Where are we? Okay, so what have we done so far? We covered CSS. I hope you found that helpful, but believe me, it's just scratching the surface. I did touch very important elements of CSS, and I left out some more obscure things. What I didn't cover at all really is just going through the long list of attributes, the things that you can do with CSS. But the others, you got the basics. Still, I find CSS pretty hard and time-consuming. Just getting pixels right, colors for me are very hard. You can see I work with primary colors mainly. But next, and HTML, we didn't really cover in much depth. We looked at div pretty much. There's a few more elements. A table is an important one. Form is an important one that you'll have to use in your assignment. But we're not going to go further down that path. Instead, what I want to show you is JavaScript. JavaScript is, it started as a language to animate web pages, to make web pages feel more lively, have things happen on the web page without necessarily going back to the server and loading another page, which is how very early sites work. And that's how JavaScript started almost 20 years ago. But recently, JavaScript became really a very widespread programming language, general purpose programming language. In fact, I've seen recently some stats saying that maybe on GitHub, the JavaScript repositories are the highest number of repositories. So it's becoming out there with languages that one would think are more general purpose. Because you think JavaScript is programming browsers. Well, that's not technically true anymore. You can run server-side applications in JavaScript. You can run desktop applications in JavaScript. And you do that through Node.js. It's a framework for running JavaScript outside of the browser. And some teams may choose Node.js to write their backend. It has the advantage that you use the same language for the backend and the front end. It has the disadvantage, or several disadvantages. One is that we are not really ready to provide you hand-holding with the Node.js. So you have to pick it up on your own. But that by itself should not be a deterrent for you. The other disadvantage is that the programming style in JavaScript, I find it a little bit hard to, I find hard to read backend applications written in JavaScript, but they can be extremely high performance. In fact, probably higher performance than you're going to get with Rails or Django. Not that you're going to get to millions of users by the end of the semester, but just in case. So, what are we going to do for JavaScript? Again, there are millions of tutorials of JavaScript out there. So I was thinking, what can I do for you that has some value on top of what's on the web? And what I thought is that we're going to program a little game that runs in the browser initially, and we're going to slowly build it up, assuming virtually no knowledge of JavaScript, but knowledge of programming in general, and really only intending to scratch the surface. I'll be essentially just pointing things in JavaScript. It's not meant to be a course on JavaScript. Okay? But you will see that you can get pretty far with JavaScript by just writing a few lines and copying and pasting some and modifying some. You can get pretty far. And the other reason I'm actually doing this, as opposed to sending you to look at the tutorial on the web, is because I'm taking this game in a future lecture and adding a backend to it that goes with the game, essentially controls the game. So that allows us to see JavaScript used in conjunction with the backend. And once we do all that, you'll be ready to do part 2 of the warm-up. Okay? And by the way, part 1 of the warm-up is due next Friday. That's a long time, and it's CSS. It's essentially what we've done so far for a little application. Let me start now. So we're now following the same notes that are in the hands-on materials, except this is part 2, the JavaScript tutorial. Okay, I have them here. Make sure I know what I'm doing. So the first thing we do, we open this file called treasure11. Okay, so what this file did, unfortunately, it left behind all of that stuff. That didn't get clear. But notice this alert box on the screen. Hello, this is JavaScript. So this file, treasure 11, all it does, it has one line of JavaScript that puts up this box. So let's look inside this file, see how it is actually built. So I clicked OK to allow this inspector to actually load. Okay, so we're in the inspector window, and notice that the actual page has nothing. In the inspector window, the panel that I now want to look at is sources. Okay? Before we looked at elements to inspect the HTML and CSS, but for JavaScript you look at sources. And here we see the list of files that contain JavaScript that have been loaded by the browser, and we see our file treasure 11. If you click on it, and then I'm going to close this left pane to make room and increase this a little bit. This is the source. This is shown in the sources. It's the HTML file, and literally this is how it looks. How I wrote it. And the interesting part is are in these 3 lines here. This is in the head of the page where we have the titles. And remember when we talked about CSS, we put here some style files. You can put script tags here. And you can put it elsewhere in the page as well. But for now, I'll keep them here. So you have this script tag, and you tell the browser this is JavaScript, and this is this type attribute that does this. I'll get to you in a minute.
Just to enlarge the image.
Increase the image?
Yeah.
Okay. I wasn't planning to go. Okay, maybe I can do this. I wasn't planning to go so big because we may not have enough room as we move along. But okay, so notice this. This is one line of JavaScript here, and it calls this function called alert. It's a built-in function in JavaScript, and it passes it a string. And the effect of that is you get this pop-up with this string, and everything blocks until the user presses OK. Okay? And there's another one like it called confirm that gets 2 buttons, yes, no. And that's how you ask questions. And I think there's another one where you get an input. Okay, I forget that one. But what's important to realize is that you put JavaScript, as the browser starts to render this page, to interpret this page, it sees JavaScript, it actually parses this code as JavaScript and runs it. And if you have commands here, they'll run right there. Okay? Alert is not a very useful command. I use it in debugging. Very, very rarely I use it in production code because it ends up in fairly ugly boxes that block the entire application. So it's probably better to have other kinds of dialog boxes. Okay, so this is called inline JavaScript, and meaning that we put the JavaScript inline in the HTML. There's another way to write JavaScript. You write it in a file by itself, and then in the script tag, you just give the URL to the file, and the browser will fetch the file separately. This way, JavaScript gets loaded with HTML. Otherwise, the browser will fetch it separately. So that's the recommended way to do it. Yes?
Will it also when it fetches a file, will it also execute any commands in it when it does it?
Technically, yes. When you parse a file, it executes any commands in it. But as you will see, you don't normally put commands like this in those files. You put declarations, meaning that executing declaration just meaning load this function and remember it. And the execution typically happens upon clicking buttons and some other events, not quite right away. But we'll talk some more about that in a while. Okay, so now we go to version 1.2.12 of this treasure file. I'm loading it. I took out the alert, so there's no more alert there. And but now I actually wrote some real JavaScript code. And as a way to introduce you to the language, let me walk you through this function that I wrote. But before we go there, let me explain what we're trying to do. What's going to be the game? So the game will be find the treasure game. And as the page loads, it's going to show you a matrix of cells ordered in columns and rows. Okay? And some of these cells, they all look the same initially, but some will have treasure in them, and some not. And there's going to be a number, a fraction of, so we tell the game to build a matrix of, let's say, 4 rows, 5 columns with 30% treasures in it. And then we're going to click on these, and if there's no treasure, simply the box opens up and shows nothing. And if there's treasure, it says you found the treasure, and it will compute a score. And it will compute a score based on how quickly you found the treasure with respect to the statistically, probabilistically expected number of clicks. So if there's 25% treasures in the matrix, if you know statistics, then it's expected that in 4 clicks, statistically, you're going to find the treasure. So if you find it in 4, you get a score of 0, par. If you find it in 5, you get a -1. If you find it in 3, you get a +1. That's really the game we're going to be building. And as we go on to a future lecture, actually we'll be doing this over the rest of today and probably the whole of next lecture. And that's going to be entirely browser-based. And then we're going to have a backend that goes with the game. And the backend will tell the browser how big the matrix, how hard, how many treasures to be, and we'll compute scores. And based on scores, it'll make the game harder and harder for you. Okay? So that's really the plan for the next probably 3 lectures. But we're going to go slowly because I'm assuming some of you really don't know JavaScript. Okay. So again, we have a script tag, and we have comments. And I like to write comments before the functions, and I write them in this kind of style of JavaDoc style that you can use to extract documentation. So we're going to write a function to generate the treasure map, this matrix. And this function is going to take 3 parameters, the number of rows, the number of columns, and the fraction of treasure. This is going to be a floating point number between 0 and 1, telling which fraction of these cells should have treasure. And we're going to use a random number generator to place the treasures. So notice the keyword function. This is how you define a function in JavaScript. And if you do it like this, at the top level of the file, it defines a global function. This function, make treasure map, will be callable from anywhere if you do it like this. You can also have single line comments like in Java and C. You can define local variables using the var keyword. Notice there's no type declaration. Okay? So this is an important point. JavaScript is a dynamically typed language, like Ruby, like Python. You don't declare types. The JavaScript compilers try to figure out what types you wanted because then they can compile it faster, but you don't have to do it. Here you declare a local variable and you initialize it with an empty list. Okay? So that brings me to what kinds of values you have in JavaScript. And there's several kinds. So values. First you have numbers, like 1, 1.1. Okay? An important thing to know, more as a curiosity, JavaScript doesn't have integers or big integers. It just has double precision numbers. So this and this are represented as double precision JavaScript. That's why we say numbers and not integers. We have strings. And you can write strings with double quotes or with a single quote. You have booleans, and the keywords true and false. And you have, what am I missing? Lists using square bracket and comma separated values. And you have objects. And objects use a brace, key, colon value, comma, and more of those key value pairs. Okay? And these are called objects. They play multiple roles. They play the roles of dictionaries and hashes from Ruby and Python, in which case you're looking up by these keys to find the values, and they actually play the roles of objects as in object-oriented programming. Java is actually has objects and classes, but in a very weird way. We'll get to that soon. Okay, so so far we initialize the treasures to an empty list. And what we're going to do now in this function to make the treasure map, we're going to go over the rows and the columns of this matrix of rows and columns. And for each one, we're going to toss a coin to figure out if it should have a treasure or not, based on this fraction of treasures that was specified to us. And we're going to collect a list of the cells with treasure. Okay, so that's the data representation that we're going to use. This treasure variable is going to contain a list of the cells that actually have the treasure. And for the list without the treasure, we don't record anything. And we do this with two nested loops. So JavaScript has for loops and has while loops. And the for loop syntax looks like in Java, like in C. We scan from I0 to number of rows, J0 to number of rows. And we're in here in this loop. So now we have to toss a coin. The way you do that is you call the random number generator. The random number generator in JavaScript is part of a built-in object called math. Okay, so I'm kind of introducing a lot of notions here. Object. Okay, so capital math, it's a built-in object. It's one of these things here I wrote at the bottom, which probably half of the class can't see because of the podium. So map is a built-in object that has several fields. One of the fields is called random, and its value is a function that every time you invoke, it will come up with a random number between 0 and 1. And you can find this from the JavaScript documentation. So rand treasure is going to be a number between 0 and 1. And if that number is less than the fraction of treasure, then we place a treasure in there. Okay? So why this works is because imagine that the fraction of treasure is 0.1. So we really have to place 10% of the cells have treasure. So every time you toss this random number generator, it's going to generate something between 0 and 1. And that number is going to be between 0 and 0.1 about 10% of the time. So I'm essentially doing this comparison. Any questions so far? No? Yes?
So at the end, the grid won't have exactly the percentage we decided.
That's
the experience.
Okay, so I don't know if you heard the comment. If you do it like this, it's not true that you will have exactly this fraction of treasure. That is correct. That's correct. This is a little bit approximate, and it's up to you to improve the game if you want. But keep in mind, very rarely you can have exactly this fraction because you only have 20 cells in a 4x5 matrix, for example, so you cannot get 0.3. Maybe 0.3 you can, but 0.33 you cannot. Anyway, let's move on. If you missed that, it's not that important. So if we're inside this conditional, we have to place a treasure. And I said that the way we record that we have a treasure is we build this list called treasures. And in this list, we have an element for every treasure cell. Okay, so this is a little bit dense here if you don't know JavaScript. First, I'm building an object with two fields called X and Y. So notice that in JavaScript, the names of the fields, you don't have to use quotes to make them a string. The JavaScript compiler interpreter will do this for you. It's a little bit unlike Python and Ruby. So this is going to record the row and the column of the cell with treasure. So this is an object, and this push is a method of the list object. Okay? Treasures was initialized, if you remember, treasures was initialized to be the empty list. So treasures is a list. Lists have methods. For example, the length method and the push method. Push method takes an object and adds it inside the list destructively. So it actually modifies the list in place. And then you return treasures. Okay? That's it. So you know JavaScript now. Any questions? Okay. So if you don't have questions, I can do a little bit more in the remaining time. So I want to show you now some of the features that the inspector has to help you debug and inspect JavaScript. Just like for CSS and HTML, we use the inspector a lot to dig in, to find out what's going on, and even to play along live, modifying it. You can do the same with JavaScript, and it's so incredibly useful that you really need to know this. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the bottom of this inspector. So the inspector has two panels. The top panel, where you can select elements, network sources, and sources show you the JavaScript. And the bottom panel, where we're going to use this console. And you see this prompt there. That's a prompt where you can type live JavaScript. You can type 1 + 1, which is a JavaScript expression. It's going to evaluate it and compute 2. Okay? You can type math. Math, I told you, it's a built-in object. And notice how it already prompts you to complete math. Math dot, and very conveniently, it shows you here everything that math can do. Okay? So we're using random. And I'm calling this function. So you can actually call JavaScript. And you see it returns this number. And if I call it again, I press the up arrow to recall the last line, produces another random number. Okay? The other thing I can do is, remember we defined this function, make treasure map. When the browser loaded this JavaScript, it executed it. But what does it mean to execute it? It saw this function declaration. It essentially loaded the declaration of the function in its internal table. So now I can actually refer to it. Make treasure map, and I can call it 4 rows, 5 columns, point 2, so 20%. Oops, sorry, there's something I didn't mean to have there. Ignore that. Okay, I ran it, and I can see the result live in this console window. So notice it returned a list, because of this bracket, with 4 objects. So it created a map with actually 4 treasures. And you can click on these little markers and expand these objects. And notice that this has x11. So cell 11 has a treasure, 13 has a treasure, and whatever, 2 more. Okay? So this is very helpful to kind of find your way around code. The other thing you can do, and this is going to be a little bit tricky because of the size here. Inside your JavaScript, you can put breakpoints. And I use this a lot. So let's put a breakpoint in here, in this line. So clicking on the line number turns on a breakpoint. And now every time that line is going to be executed, the debugger is going to stop there. And I'm going to execute it by going to the console, recalling this invocation from before, calling it. And notice how you get this thing here saying paused in the debugger. If you click here, it actually keeps going. Or you can go to the debugger window. And now the size is actually a little problem here. So I'm going to shrink it a little bit. And it shows that the execution has stopped here. It actually, very conveniently, it shows for every line, it annotates the line with the values of the variables that are referenced in that line. And I can see very quickly the value even of the rand treasure. Okay. And let me actually close this. And what you can do, if you're stopped in the debugger, you can actually inspect variables. You can even run code. For example, I'm going to copy this code, this conditional, and run it here. So you can run in the console code to essentially test what if. What if I were to run this code? Okay, so this would execute to false. So when you're starting the debugger, the console has all of the current execution context, which is really very helpful for inspecting, for finding your way around. So sometimes you will see me when I'm developing JavaScript, I don't write it all at once, especially the tricky parts. I just put the scaffolding and then I put a breakpoint there, and I go inspect from the console and figure out exactly what I should write in that event handler, because it's hard to remember all of the quirks of how event handlers work. We'll see that in the next lecture. Okay, so in the next lecture, we'll continue this game, and I expect that we'll probably finish it by the end of the lecture. And in the process of that, we'll learn more JavaScript, we'll learn jQuery, a very useful library, and how to actually interact and construct things on the page, and handle events that happen on the page, like clicks. Okay? That's it for today. Are there any questions about the project and the process? Let me say one thing, because I got the question during the break. What's happening next is we got your ratings, and today we're going to decide what is the list of proposals that are still in play. And we're probably going to be posting 25 proposals. These are your highly ranked proposals. Some proposals have external proposers. Okay? Those, I hope you will give it a good consideration, because even though the idea might not be as exciting as an idea that the student generated, the fact that you actually have a customer who probably has a business goal in mind, it's going to be a very important element of your software engineering experience, working with customers. Okay? So we're going to post these, and you have until right after Labor Day to express your preferences. And you're going to say, this is my first preference, my second, my fourth preference. And I would really like to work with this student and this student. And you're going to also say how much experience you have with front and back end. We take that in, and we form the teams. We form the teams based first on your preferences. Second, we're going to try to put people who want to work together. It's going to help if you and your friend want to work together to vote for the same project. Okay? If you vote for different projects and want to be together, it makes our job harder. And we're going to be announcing the teams early next week after you give us your preferences. Actually, maybe middle of next week. And then the teams are ready to go. Meanwhile, you should work on part 1 of the Swan project. Okay? And one more thing, I won't be able to post the video